the forbidden origin of the black people. What ancient texts say about the black people and humanity's hidden past. What if I told you that some of the most profound truths about human origins have been deliberately obscured for centuries? What if the very foundations of how we understand the beginnings of different peoples have been filtered through lenses that serve certain narratives while burying others? Today, we're diving deep into ancient texts, archaeological evidence, and historical records that reveal a story about black people and humanity's earliest chapters that might completely reshape everything you thought you knew. The story we're about to uncover isn't just another historical curiosity. It's a journey through forbidden knowledge, suppressed discoveries, and ancient wisdom that challenges the mainstream narrative about human civilization. We're talking about texts that predate many of the sources typically cited in academic circles, artifacts that don't fit the conventional timeline, and evidence that points to a far more complex and interconnected ancient world than most people realize. But here's what makes this exploration truly fascinating. The ancient texts we'll examine don't just mention black people as footnotes or side characters. They position them at the very center of humanity's earliest developments, as founders of civilizations, keepers of knowledge, and integral players in the grand story of human progress. These aren't modern interpretations or wishful thinking. These are direct translations from stone tablets, papyri, and manuscripts that have survived millennia. The reason this information feels forbidden isn't because it's false or fabricated. It's because acknowledging these truths would require a fundamental shift in how we view the development of human civilization. It would mean accepting that the narrative many of us learned in school represents just one perspective, often filtered through the cultural biases of those who wrote the history books. We're going to examine Sumerian tablets that describe the earliest human societies, Egyptian hieroglyphs that detail complex relationships between different peoples, biblical genealogies that trace human lineages back to their origins, and even lesser-known texts from civilizations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Each of these sources adds another piece to a puzzle that, when assembled, reveals a picture of human origins that's far richer and more nuanced than the simplified versions we've been given. But what's particularly compelling is how these ancient sources corroborate each other across different cultures and time periods. When you see the same themes and descriptions appearing in texts from civilizations that had no contact with each other, you start to realize you're looking at something that transcends cultural storytelling. You're looking at preserved memory. The ancient world was far more interconnected than we've been led to believe. Trade routes, cultural exchanges, and migrations created a web of relationships that spanned continents. Black peoples weren't isolated in one corner of the world, while civilization developed elsewhere. They were active participants, often leaders, in the earliest human societies from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, from the Nile to the Mediterranean. Let's start with something that might surprise you. The oldest creation myths and origin stories from multiple civilizations describe the first humans in ways that don't align with the typical representations we see in modern depictions. Ancient Sumerian texts, some of the earliest written records we have, describe humanity's beginnings in terms that suggest a diversity of peoples from the very start, not a gradual branching out from a single group. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest literary works, contains descriptions of peoples and lands that paint a picture of an ancient world where black peoples held positions of tremendous influence and authority. But these aren't the sanitized versions you might find in typical academic discussions. These are the raw translations that reveal the true scope of interaction between different groups in the ancient world. Moving beyond Mesopotamia, we encounter Egyptian texts that provide even more detailed accounts. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers, and their hieroglyphic inscriptions contain extensive genealogies and historical accounts that trace the movements and relationships of various peoples across Africa and beyond. These records don't just mention black peoples. They describe them as pharaohs, priests, scholars, and architects of some of humanity's greatest early achievements. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Egyptian records also describe interactions with peoples from lands far beyond Africa. They document trade relationships, diplomatic missions, and cultural exchanges that reveal a level of global connectivity in the ancient world that challenges everything we've been taught about the isolation of early civilizations. The biblical texts, when examined in their original Hebrew and Greek, contain genealogical information that traces human lineages back to their earliest origins. These aren't just spiritual allegories. They're historical records that provide detailed accounts of how different peoples spread across the ancient world. The genealogies in Genesis, for example, describe the descendants of Noah's sons and their roles in populating different regions of the earth. What's fascinating is how these biblical accounts align with archaeological evidence and other ancient texts. When you compare the biblical genealogies with Sumerian king lists, Egyptian dynastic records, and other ancient historical documents, you start to see consistent patterns emerge. These sources don't contradict each other. They complement each other, providing different perspectives on the same historical events. The descendants of Ham, according to these ancient texts, weren't confined to one small region. They established major civilizations across Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The kingdoms of Kush, Egypt, and other powerful ancient states weren't peripheral players in world history. They were central to the development of human civilization, contributing advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and philosophy that influenced cultures across the known world. But the story doesn't stop with the most famous civilizations. Ancient texts from India, China, and other Asian cultures contain references to black peoples that suggest far more extensive contact and influence than mainstream history acknowledges. The Vedic texts of ancient India, for example, contain descriptions of peoples and places that align remarkably with what we know about ancient African civilizations. Chinese historical records, some dating back thousands of years, describe diplomatic and trade relationships with kingdoms that can only be identified as African states. These weren't occasional contacts or chance encounters. They were ongoing relationships that suggest a level of global interaction in the ancient world that we're only beginning to understand. The archaeological evidence supports what these texts describe. Artifacts found in ancient sites across Africa show clear evidence of advanced metallurgy, sophisticated urban planning, complex trade networks, and artistic achievements that rival anything produced by other ancient civilizations. But much of this evidence has been downplayed or ignored because it doesn't fit the conventional narrative about human development. Recent discoveries in places like the Kingdom of Kush have revealed cities and monuments that demonstrate levels of engineering and architectural sophistication that challenge our assumptions about ancient African capabilities. These weren't primitive societies struggling to survive. They were advanced civilizations with complex social structures, extensive trade networks, and sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. The ancient texts don't just describe these civilizations. They explain how knowledge and technology spread between different peoples through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The picture that emerges is of an ancient world where black peoples weren't recipients of civilization from elsewhere. They were active creators and distributors of the knowledge and innovations that shaped human development. What makes this exploration particularly compelling is how these ancient sources describe the character and capabilities of different peoples. The texts don't present stereotypical or diminished portrayals. They describe black peoples as wise rulers, skilled craftsmen, powerful warriors, and keepers of sacred knowledge. These descriptions come from multiple independent sources across different cultures and time periods. The Nubian pharaohs who ruled Egypt, for example, are described in contemporary texts as bringing prosperity, justice, and cultural renaissance to the region. The Kingdom of Aksum, in what is now Ethiopia, is documented in Roman and Byzantine sources as one of the great powers of the ancient world, controlling vital trade routes and wielding significant political influence. These weren't isolated examples or brief moments of prominence. The ancient texts describe sustained periods of black leadership, innovation, and cultural influence that lasted for centuries. The conventional narrative that presents black peoples as marginal players in ancient history simply doesn't align with what the primary sources actually say. As we continue this exploration, we'll dive deeper into specific texts and archaeological discoveries that reveal even more about humanity's hidden past. We'll examine how certain interpretations became dominant while others were suppressed, and we'll look at the evidence that's forcing scholars to reconsider long-held assumptions about human origins and development. The story we're uncovering isn't just about correcting historical inaccuracies. It's about understanding the true scope of human achievement and the interconnected nature of our earliest civilizations. It's about recognizing that the diversity we see in the modern world isn't a recent development. It's been a fundamental characteristic of human society from the very beginning. The ancient texts reveal a world where different peoples contributed unique strengths and perspectives to the collective human experience. They show us that the boundaries and divisions we often take for granted today weren't the defining characteristics of the ancient world. Instead, we see evidence of cooperation, exchange, and mutual influence that created the foundation for everything that followed. Now, when we examine the most ancient Sumerian texts, something remarkable emerges that challenges everything we think we know about early human civilization. The cuneiform tablets from Ur, dating back over 4,000 years, don't just mention different peoples in passing. They provide detailed accounts of complex societies led by rulers whose descriptions don't match the typical portrayals we see in modern textbooks. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance. When you read the original cuneiform translations, not the sanitized versions that filter out inconvenient details, you discover descriptions of kingdoms and peoples that paint a completely different picture of the ancient world. The text describes rulers and wise men whose physical characteristics and origins clearly point to African lineages, but who wielded power and influence across vast territories that extended far beyond the African continent. These weren't primitive tribal leaders. The Sumerian texts describe sophisticated urban centers, advanced agricultural techniques, and complex trade networks that connected Africa with Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and beyond. The level of organization and technological advancement described in these texts suggests civilizations that were far more developed than mainstream archaeology has been willing to acknowledge. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. The Sumerian king lists, those meticulous records of rulers and dynasties, contain names and descriptions that align remarkably with African linguistic patterns and cultural traditions. When you trace these connections through multiple ancient sources, you start to see evidence of African influence in the very foundations of Mesopotamian civilization. Moving eastward, the ancient texts from the Indus Valley civilization reveal similar patterns. The Harappan script, still partially undeciphered, contains symbols and linguistic structures that show clear connections to African writing systems. The urban planning of cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro demonstrates engineering principles that appear first in the African contexts, then spread throughout the ancient world. The Vedic texts of ancient India, when examined in their oldest forms, contain descriptions of peoples and places that can only be understood in the context of extensive African contact and influence. The Rig Veda describes rulers and sages whose characteristics and origins clearly point to African lineages, but who played central roles in shaping early Indian civilization. These connections aren't coincidental. They represent evidence of sustained cultural exchange and influence that challenges our basic assumptions about how human civilization developed. The ancient world wasn't a collection of isolated societies slowly developing in parallel. It was an interconnected network where knowledge, technology, and cultural innovations moved freely between different regions and peoples. The Egyptian hieroglyphic records provide perhaps the most detailed evidence of this interconnected ancient world. The temple inscriptions at Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel don't just record local events. They document extensive diplomatic, trade, and cultural relationships that spanned continents. These records describe African kingdoms that maintained regular contact with civilizations in Asia, Europe, and even the Americas. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and other ancient powers, reveal a level of international sophistication that rivals modern diplomatic systems. These texts describe African rulers who were treated as equals by their counterparts in Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire. They negotiated complex treaties, arranged royal marriages, and coordinated military alliances that shaped the political landscape of the ancient world. But the Egyptian records go beyond just political relationships. They document the movement of scholars, craftsmen, and religious leaders between different civilizations. The texts describe African priests who served in temples across the Mediterranean, African architects who designed buildings in distant lands, and African scholars who contributed to the development of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine in multiple cultures. The medical papyri, in particular, reveal the extent of African influence on ancient science and healing practices. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus contain medical knowledge that was clearly developed through extensive cross-cultural exchange. The surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic methods described in these texts show evidence of knowledge systems that originated in Africa, but were refined and expanded through contact with other civilizations. When we turn to the Hebrew scriptures, the genealogical records provide a different but equally compelling perspective on these ancient relationships. The Table of Nations in Genesis doesn't just list names, it provides a detailed map of how different peoples spread across the ancient world and established the major civilizations that would shape human history. The descendants of Ham, according to these texts, weren't confined to a single region or relegated to minor roles in human development. They established kingdoms that became the centers of learning, trade, and cultural innovation in the ancient world. The biblical accounts describe these kingdoms in terms that clearly indicate their central importance to the development of human civilization. Nimrod, described as a mighty hunter and kingdom builder, is associated with the founding of major cities in Mesopotamia. But when you examine the linguistic and cultural evidence, his origins point clearly to African traditions and lineages. The cities attributed to him, including Babylon and Nineveh, show architectural and urban planning principles that first appear in African contexts. The kingdom of Kush receives particular attention in the biblical texts, not as a distant or exotic land, but as a major power that played a central role in the politics and culture of the ancient world. The biblical descriptions of Kushite wealth, military power, and cultural sophistication align perfectly with the archaeological evidence we're now discovering at sites like Kerma, Dongola, and Meroe. These Kushite cities weren't primitive settlements. They were sophisticated urban centers with advanced metallurgy, complex irrigation systems, and monumental architecture that rivals anything built by other ancient civilizations. The ironworking techniques developed in Kush were so advanced that they influenced technological development across Africa and beyond. The biblical accounts also describe extensive trade relationships between Kushite kingdoms and other ancient powers. The Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon, for example, represents just one documented instance of diplomatic and economic exchange between African kingdoms and other ancient civilizations. The gifts described in the biblical account, gold, spices, and precious stones, represent trade goods that moved along established routes connecting Africa with Asia and the Mediterranean. But the archaeological evidence reveals that these trade networks were far more extensive than the biblical accounts suggest. Recent discoveries in the Arabian Peninsula have uncovered African artifacts that indicate regular trade relationships spanning thousands of miles. Similarly, African goods have been found at archaeological sites across Asia, suggesting trade networks that connected the entire ancient world. The Chinese historical records provide another fascinating perspective on these ancient relationships. The Han Dynasty chronicles describe diplomatic missions to kingdoms that can only be identified as African states. These weren't chance encounters or brief contacts. They represent sustained relationships that involved regular exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. The Chinese texts describe African envoys who brought exotic goods and new technologies to the Chinese court. They also document Chinese expeditions to African lands, describing kingdoms with advanced urban centers, sophisticated administrative systems, and impressive military capabilities. These accounts challenge the conventional narrative that presents ancient China as isolated from the rest of the world. The maritime capabilities described in these ancient texts are particularly remarkable. The Chinese chronicles describe African vessels that were capable of long-distance ocean voyages, sophisticated navigation techniques, and advanced shipbuilding technologies. These descriptions align with archaeological evidence of ancient harbor facilities along the African coast that were clearly designed for major maritime operations. The Indian Ocean trade networks, according to these ancient sources, weren't dominated by any single civilization. Instead, they represented a cooperative system where African, Arabian, Indian, and Chinese traders worked together to move goods and ideas across vast distances. This system facilitated the exchange of not just material goods, but also scientific knowledge, artistic techniques, and cultural innovations. The Persian texts provide yet another perspective on these ancient relationships. The Avesta and other Zoroastrian texts describe peoples and lands that clearly correspond to African kingdoms. These descriptions emphasize the wealth, wisdom, and military power of these African states, presenting them as major players in the ancient world's political and cultural landscape. The archaeological evidence from Persia itself reveals extensive African influence on Persian culture and technology. African artistic motifs appear in Persian art. African metallurgical techniques influenced Persian craftsmanship, and African architectural principles can be seen in major Persian monuments. This wasn't superficial borrowing. It represents deep cultural exchange that influenced the fundamental development of Persian civilization. The Greek and Roman texts, when examined carefully, provide similar evidence of extensive African influence on Mediterranean civilizations. The descriptions of African kingdoms in the works of Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, and other ancient historians reveal sophisticated political systems, advanced technologies, and impressive cultural achievements. These classical authors didn't present African civilizations as primitive or backward. Instead, they described them with admiration and respect, noting their military prowess, architectural achievements, and intellectual accomplishments. The descriptions of African rulers in these texts emphasize their wisdom, justice, and effective governance. The archaeological evidence from Greece and Rome confirms what these ancient texts describe. African goods, artistic influences, and technological innovations appear throughout the archaeological record of Mediterranean civilizations. This evidence points to sustained cultural exchange that profoundly influenced the development of what we now call Western civilization. As we piece together these various sources, a remarkable picture emerges of an ancient world where African peoples weren't marginalized or isolated. They were central players in a global network of civilizations that shared knowledge, technology, and cultural innovations across vast distances. This interconnected ancient world challenges everything we've been taught about how human civilization developed. The evidence we've uncovered so far represents just the surface of a much deeper mystery. When you start connecting these ancient sources with archaeological discoveries that have been quietly accumulating in university archives and private collections, the picture becomes even more compelling. We're talking about artifacts that don't fit the conventional timeline, discoveries that have been downplayed or ignored because they challenge fundamental assumptions about human development. Let me take you to some specific sites that most people have never heard of, places where the physical evidence tells a story that mainstream archaeology has struggled to explain. In the highlands of Ethiopia, recent excavations have uncovered urban complexes that predate many of the civilizations we typically associate with early human development. These aren't simple village settlements. They're sophisticated cities with advanced water management systems, monumental architecture, and evidence of complex social organization. The stonework at these sites demonstrates engineering techniques that challenge our understanding of ancient capabilities. Massive blocks fitted together with precision that rivals modern construction, astronomical alignments that indicate sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, and urban planning that suggests populations far larger than conventional estimates would support. But here's what makes these discoveries particularly significant. The dating techniques consistently place these sites much earlier than mainstream archaeology has been comfortable acknowledging. Carbon dating, thermoluminescence, and other scientific methods all point to the same conclusion. These civilizations were flourishing when conventional history says they shouldn't have existed. Similar discoveries have been made across the African continent, from the stone circles of Senegambia to the terraced cities of the Ethiopian highlands. Each site tells the same story of advanced civilizations that developed far earlier and achieved far more than the standard narrative suggests. When you examine these sites alongside the ancient texts we've been discussing, the alignment is remarkable. The Dogon people of Mali present another fascinating piece of this puzzle. Their astronomical knowledge, passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years, contains information about celestial bodies that weren't officially discovered by Western science until the 20th century. They describe the orbital characteristics of Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye, with accuracy that would require sophisticated astronomical instruments. Their creation myths and historical accounts describe contact with beings from these distant star systems, encounters that they say occurred in the deep past when their civilization was first establishing itself. Whether you interpret these accounts literally or symbolically, they represent a level of astronomical knowledge that challenges our assumptions about ancient African capabilities. The linguistic evidence provides another compelling layer to this investigation. When you examine the root structures of ancient languages across different continents, patterns emerge that suggest far more extensive contact between ancient peoples than conventional history acknowledges. African linguistic influences appear in the foundational vocabularies of languages from India to Ireland, from China to the Americas. These aren't simple borrowings or chance similarities. They represent systematic linguistic relationships that could only have developed through sustained contact over long periods. The mathematical and astronomical terminologies are particularly revealing, suggesting that African civilizations were not just participating in ancient scientific development, but were often leading it. The ancient astronomical texts provide some of the most compelling evidence of advanced African civilizations. The Babylonian astronomical records, when traced to their sources, reveal knowledge systems that clearly originated in African contexts. The sophisticated mathematical calculations used to predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and maintain accurate calendars all show evidence of African innovation and influence. The Egyptian astronomical texts are even more explicit. The ceiling of the Dendera temple contains star maps that demonstrate understanding of celestial mechanics that wouldn't be matched by European astronomy for thousands of years. These aren't primitive attempts at skywatching. They're sophisticated scientific documents that reveal deep understanding of cosmic cycles and planetary relationships. But the Egyptian astronomical knowledge extends far beyond simple observation. The texts describe mathematical relationships between celestial bodies that indicate understanding of gravitational effects, orbital mechanics, and cosmic distances that shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology. Yet the mathematical calculations are there, preserved in stone and papyrus, waiting for modern science to catch up with ancient knowledge. The medical texts present similar evidence of advanced knowledge systems. The surgical procedures described in ancient African medical papyri include techniques that weren't rediscovered by modern medicine until the 19th and 20th centuries. Brain surgery, cataract removal, and complex orthopedic procedures are all documented in texts that predate similar developments in other civilizations by centuries or millennia. The pharmaceutical knowledge preserved in these ancient texts is equally impressive. Detailed descriptions of medicinal plants, chemical preparations, and treatment protocols demonstrate understanding of human physiology and biochemistry that challenges our assumptions about ancient medical capabilities. Many of these ancient remedies are still used in modern medicine, their effectiveness confirmed by contemporary scientific research. The metallurgical evidence tells a similar story of advanced ancient capabilities. African metalworking techniques, particularly in iron and steel production, were so advanced that they influenced technological development across the ancient world. The quality of ancient African steel was so high that it became legendary, sought after by warriors and craftsmen from distant lands. The archaeological evidence from ancient African mining operations reveals sophisticated understanding of geology, chemistry, and engineering. These weren't simple surface mining operations. They were deep shaft mines with advanced ventilation systems, ore processing facilities, and transportation networks that rival modern industrial operations. The ancient maps present perhaps the most intriguing evidence of all. Portolan charts and other medieval maps contain information about African coastlines, inland features, and geographic relationships that shouldn't have been available to the cartographers who created them. These maps show detailed knowledge of African geography that predates official European exploration by centuries. The Piri Reis map of 1513 is particularly fascinating. It shows the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy, depicting geographic features that weren't officially discovered until the 20th century. The source materials for this map, according to Piri Reis himself, included ancient charts that originated in African and other ancient civilizations. When you examine these maps alongside the ancient texts describing African maritime capabilities, a picture emerges of sophisticated navigation systems and global exploration that predates the conventional age of discovery by thousands of years. The ancient Africans weren't waiting for others to discover them. They were actively exploring and mapping the world. The architectural evidence provides another compelling dimension to this investigation. The precision of ancient African stonework, the sophistication of their engineering solutions, and the scale of their construction projects all point to civilizations with capabilities that match or exceed those of better-known ancient cultures. The Great Zimbabwe ruins, the stone cities of Ethiopia, and the megalithic complexes scattered across the African continent all demonstrate architectural principles and construction techniques that challenge our understanding of ancient capabilities. These weren't the products of primitive societies. They were created by civilizations with advanced understanding of mathematics, engineering, and materials science. The artistic evidence reveals similar sophistication. Ancient African sculptures, paintings, and decorative arts demonstrate technical skill and aesthetic sensibility that rivals the best work of any ancient civilization. The bronze work from Benin, the rock art of the Sahara, and the sculptural traditions of Nok all represent artistic achievements of the highest order. But it's not just the technical skill that's impressive. It's the subject matter and symbolic content that reveals the depth of ancient African knowledge systems. The artistic works contain astronomical information, mathematical relationships, and scientific concepts that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of natural principles. The trade networks documented in these various sources reveal the true scope of ancient African influence. These weren't simple regional trading systems. They were global networks that connected Africa with civilizations on every continent. African goods, ideas, and technologies moved along these networks, influencing development across the ancient world. The archaeological evidence of these trade relationships appears at sites from Scandinavia to Southeast Asia. African ivory has been found in ancient Chinese tombs, African gold in Scandinavian burial sites, and African artistic influences in archaeological contexts across Europe and Asia. This evidence points to trade relationships that were both extensive and sustained over long periods. The monetary systems documented in ancient texts reveal another dimension of African influence. Several ancient civilizations used African-originated monetary standards, weight systems, and trade protocols. These systems weren't imposed through conquest. They were adopted because of their sophistication and reliability. The educational systems described in ancient texts present perhaps the most compelling evidence of African intellectual leadership. The ancient universities of Timbuktu, Alexandria, and other African centers of learning attracted students from across the known world. These weren't regional schools serving local populations. They were international centers of scholarship that shaped intellectual development across multiple civilizations. The curriculum at these ancient institutions included advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and theology. The texts describe educational standards and scholarly achievements that wouldn't be matched in other parts of the world for centuries. The scholars produced by these institutions went on to influence intellectual development across multiple continents. The preservation of knowledge through various catastrophic periods reveals another important aspect of African civilization. While other ancient libraries and centers of learning were destroyed by wars, natural disasters, and cultural upheavals, African knowledge systems often survived through sophisticated preservation techniques and distributed storage methods. The oral traditions that preserved this knowledge across millennia represent one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. The precision with which complex information was maintained and transmitted across generations rivals any written system. Modern studies of these oral traditions continue to reveal historical and scientific information that was thought to be lost forever. As we delve deeper into this evidence, patterns emerge that challenge everything we've been taught about human development. The conventional narrative of civilization spreading from a few centers to gradually enlighten the rest of the world simply doesn't match what the primary sources reveal. Instead, we see evidence of a much more complex and interconnected ancient world where knowledge, technology, and cultural innovations flowed freely between different peoples and civilizations. The African contribution to this ancient global civilization wasn't peripheral or derivative. It was foundational. The evidence suggests that many of the innovations and knowledge systems that shaped human development originated in African contexts and then spread to influence civilizations worldwide. This isn't about replacing one cultural bias with another. It's about recognizing the true complexity and interconnectedness of human development. The implications of this evidence extend far beyond historical curiosity. They challenge fundamental assumptions about human capabilities, cultural development, and the relationship between different civilizations. When you understand the true scope of ancient African achievements, you begin to see the modern world in a completely different light. The systematic suppression of this evidence over the past several centuries represents one of history's greatest intellectual tragedies. Entire libraries of knowledge have been dismissed, ignored, or deliberately obscured because acknowledging their contents would require fundamental changes in how we understand human development. But the evidence is still there, waiting in ancient texts, archaeological sites, and cultural traditions around the world. As we continue this exploration, We'll examine even more specific examples of how this ancient knowledge has been preserved and how modern discoveries are forcing scholars to reconsider long-held assumptions about human history. The story we're uncovering isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the true foundations of human civilization and recognizing the contributions that all peoples have made to our collective development. The religious texts themselves provide perhaps the most detailed roadmap to understanding these ancient connections. When you examine the original Hebrew manuscripts of the Torah, something extraordinary emerges that most translations have obscured. The genealogical records don't just list names and lineages. They provide detailed descriptions of the characteristics, territories, and achievements of different peoples that paint a radically different picture of the ancient world. The descendants of Cush, for instance, aren't described as a minor tribe confined to a small region. The texts describe a powerful civilization that established cities, controlled trade routes, and wielded influence across vast territories. The Hebrew word Cush itself appears in contexts that suggest not just a single nation, but a network of related peoples who dominated large portions of the ancient world. When you trace these genealogical connections through multiple ancient sources, patterns emerge that challenge everything we've been taught about ancient demographics. The territories associated with Kushite peoples in these texts extend far beyond what conventional history acknowledges. We're talking about influence that reached from the Horn of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, from the Levant to the Indus Valley. The archaeological evidence supports what these genealogical texts describe. Recent excavations in southern Arabia have uncovered cities and monuments that show clear African architectural influences. The building techniques, artistic styles, and urban planning principles all point to direct cultural connections with African civilizations. These weren't trading posts or temporary settlements. They were permanent cities built by people who carried African knowledge and traditions with them. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. The DNA evidence from ancient burial sites in these regions tells a story that aligns perfectly with what the ancient texts describe. Genetic studies of remains from sites across the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, and even parts of Asia show African lineages dating back thousands of years. These weren't isolated individuals who somehow ended up far from home. They represent substantial populations with clear genetic connections to African peoples. The linguistic evidence provides another compelling layer to this puzzle. When you examine the root structures of ancient Semitic languages, clear African influences emerge in the foundational vocabulary. The words for fundamental concepts like kingship, wisdom, craftsmanship, and sacred knowledge all show linguistic connections to African language families. This isn't superficial borrowing. It represents deep structural relationships that could only develop through sustained cultural contact over long periods. The ancient trade documents reveal the economic foundation that made this cultural exchange possible. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamian archives describe regular commercial relationships with African kingdoms that extended far beyond simple commodity trading. These documents detail complex financial instruments, insurance systems, and credit arrangements that facilitated commerce across vast distances. The sophistication of these ancient economic systems rivals modern international trade networks. The texts describe standardized weights and measures, quality control protocols, and dispute resolution mechanisms that enabled reliable commerce between civilizations separated by thousands of miles. African merchants weren't junior partners in these networks. They were often the organizers and controllers of trade routes that connected multiple continents. The religious texts from various traditions provide another fascinating perspective on these ancient relationships. The Vedic literature of ancient India contains detailed descriptions of peoples and lands that can only be identified as African kingdoms. These texts don't present these kingdoms as distant or exotic. They describe them as integral parts of the ancient world's political and spiritual landscape. The Buddhist texts contain similar references to African kingdoms and peoples. The Jataka tales, ancient stories that preserve historical memory through narrative, describe regular contact between Indian and African civilizations. These stories include detailed descriptions of African cities, customs, and achievements that demonstrate intimate knowledge of African societies. The Christian texts, particularly the early church documents, reveal extensive African influence on the development of Christianity itself. The Coptic texts from Egypt contain theological and philosophical works that shaped Christian doctrine for centuries. But beyond Egypt, early Christian documents describe thriving Christian communities across Africa that were centers of theological scholarship and missionary activity. The Ethiopian Orthodox texts are particularly revealing. They contain historical chronicles that describe the conversion of Ethiopian kingdoms to Christianity in the earliest centuries of the faith. But these texts also describe Ethiopian Christian missionaries who traveled throughout Africa, Asia, and even Europe, spreading the faith and establishing churches. The scope of Ethiopian Christian influence described in these texts extends far beyond what conventional church history acknowledges. The Islamic texts provide yet another perspective on African influence in the ancient world. The early Islamic chronicles describe African kingdoms that were major players in the politics and economics of the medieval period. The descriptions of the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and other West African states in these texts emphasize their wealth, military power, and cultural sophistication. The Hajj records from Mecca provide particularly detailed evidence of African influence in the Islamic world. The descriptions of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century reveal not just individual wealth, but the economic power of African kingdoms. The gold that Mansa Musa distributed during his journey reportedly affected the price of gold in Mediterranean markets for decades. But the Islamic texts also describe much earlier African influence on Islamic civilization. The chronicles mention African scholars, theologians, and administrators who played central roles in the development of Islamic institutions. The University of Al-Azhar in Cairo, one of the oldest centers of Islamic learning, was heavily influenced by African intellectual traditions that predated Islam by centuries. The astronomical texts present some of the most compelling evidence of advanced African knowledge systems. The ancient African astronomical observations recorded in various texts demonstrate understanding of celestial mechanics that wouldn't be matched by other civilizations for centuries. The precision of these observations required not just sophisticated instruments, but also mathematical systems capable of complex calculations. The Dogon astronomical knowledge represents just one example of this advanced understanding. Their descriptions of stellar systems, planetary movements, and cosmic relationships demonstrate knowledge that modern astronomy has only recently confirmed. The mathematical precision of their astronomical calculations suggests knowledge systems that were developed through centuries of careful observation and mathematical analysis. The agricultural texts reveal another dimension of African innovation that influenced civilizations worldwide. The ancient Africans developed crop varieties, farming techniques, and food preservation methods that were adopted by cultures across the globe. The archaeological evidence shows that many of the food crops that became staples in other civilizations were originally developed in African contexts. The irrigation systems described in ancient African texts were particularly sophisticated. The engineering principles used in these systems influenced hydraulic engineering across the ancient world. The archaeological remains of ancient African irrigation networks reveal understanding of hydrology, materials science, and construction techniques that rival modern engineering capabilities. The metallurgical texts provide evidence of African technological leadership that extended across multiple industries. The ancient African metalworkers didn't just excel in iron and steel production. They developed advanced techniques for working with gold, silver, copper, and other metals that influence craftsmanship worldwide. The quality of ancient African metalwork was so renowned that African-made items became status symbols in distant civilizations. The mining texts reveal the geological knowledge that supported these metallurgical achievements. Ancient African miners developed techniques for locating ore deposits, extracting minerals from deep underground, and processing raw materials that were far ahead of their time. The scale of ancient African mining operations, as revealed by archaeological evidence, suggests industrial capabilities that challenge our understanding of ancient technology. The navigation texts provide evidence of African maritime capabilities that enabled global exploration and trade. The ancient Africans developed sophisticated navigation techniques that allowed them to traverse vast ocean distances with remarkable accuracy. The mathematical principles underlying these navigation systems demonstrate understanding of spherical geometry and celestial mechanics that was extremely advanced for its time. The shipbuilding texts describe vessel construction techniques that were adopted by maritime civilizations around the world. The archaeological evidence of ancient African harbors and shipyards reveals industrial capabilities that supported extensive maritime operations. These weren't simple coastal fishing operations. They were major maritime industries that enabled global commerce and exploration. The medical texts reveal another area where African knowledge systems influence global development. The surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques described in ancient African medical texts were far ahead of their time. Many of these ancient medical innovations are still used in modern medicine, their effectiveness confirmed by contemporary research. The educational texts describe institutional systems that attracted students from around the world. The ancient African universities weren't just regional centers of learning, they were international institutions that shaped intellectual development across multiple civilizations. The curriculum, teaching methods, and scholarly standards described in these texts set precedents that influenced educational systems worldwide. The philosophical texts reveal the intellectual foundations that supported these various achievements. Ancient African philosophers developed sophisticated systems of thought that addressed fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, ethics, and human nature. These philosophical systems influenced intellectual development across multiple cultures and continue to shape modern thought in ways that are rarely acknowledged. The legal texts describe governmental and judicial systems that were models of sophistication and fairness. The ancient African legal codes influenced the development of law in civilizations around the world. The principles of justice, governance, and social organization described in these texts demonstrate political sophistication that rivals modern democratic systems. The architectural texts reveal the engineering knowledge that supported the construction of monuments and cities that still amaze modern observers. The mathematical principles, construction techniques, and materials science described in these texts demonstrate capabilities that challenge our understanding of ancient technology. The precision and scale of ancient African architecture rivals the best achievements of any ancient civilization. The artistic texts describe aesthetic principles and creative techniques that influenced artistic development worldwide. Ancient African artists didn't just create beautiful objects. They developed artistic theories and techniques that shaped the evolution of art across multiple cultures. The influence of African artistic traditions can be traced through the artistic heritage of civilizations on every continent. As we examine all of this evidence together, a picture emerges of ancient African civilizations that weren't peripheral to world development, but were central to it. The knowledge systems, technologies, and cultural innovations that originated in African contexts influenced the development of human civilization in ways that we're only beginning to understand. This wasn't a one-way flow of influence from a few advanced civilizations to primitive peoples. It was a complex network of cultural exchange where African contributions were often foundational. The systematic obscuring of this evidence over the past several centuries represents more than just academic oversight. It reflects deliberate choices about which narratives to preserve and which to suppress. The ancient texts and archaeological evidence we've examined today have always been available to scholars. The choice to downplay or ignore this evidence reflects cultural biases that have shaped our understanding of human history. But the evidence is still there, preserved in stone and papyrus, waiting in archaeological sites and cultural traditions around the world. As more scholars begin to examine this evidence with fresh eyes, free from the preconceptions that have shaped previous interpretations, the true complexity and richness of human development is finally beginning to emerge. The implications extend far beyond academic history. When you understand the true scope of ancient African achievements and their influence on global development, you begin to see the modern world in a completely different light. The technologies we use, the knowledge systems we rely on, and the cultural traditions we value all have roots that extend back to these ancient African innovations. This isn't about replacing one cultural bias with another, or diminishing the achievements of other civilizations. It's about recognizing the true interconnectedness of human development and acknowledging the contributions that all peoples have made to our collective heritage. When you see the full picture of ancient human achievement, you realize that the diversity and creativity that characterizes modern civilization has been a fundamental aspect of human society from the very beginning. The ancient texts don't just tell us about the past. They provide insights that can help us understand the present and shape the future. When you recognize the patterns of cultural exchange, technological innovation, and intellectual development that characterize the ancient world, you gain perspective on the challenges and opportunities facing modern civilization. The knowledge systems developed by ancient African civilizations weren't just historical curiosities. They represent sophisticated approaches to understanding and manipulating the natural world that can inform modern scientific and technological development. The social and political systems they created offer models for addressing contemporary challenges of governance, justice, and social organization. As we continue to uncover and examine this evidence, we're not just learning about ancient history, we're discovering resources that can help us build a better future. The ancient texts remind us that human beings have always been capable of remarkable achievements when they work together, share knowledge freely, and recognize the value of diversity in approaches to solving problems. The story we've begun to uncover today represents just the beginning of a much larger investigation. There are thousands of ancient texts that haven't been fully examined, archaeological sites that haven't been properly excavated, and cultural traditions that haven't been adequately documented. Each of these sources has the potential to reveal additional evidence of the complex and interconnected nature of ancient human civilization. But even with the evidence we've examined today, the picture is clear. The ancient world was far more sophisticated, interconnected, and diverse than conventional history acknowledges. African peoples weren't waiting on the margins of civilization for others to discover and enlighten them. They were active creators and leaders in the development of the knowledge systems, technologies, and cultural innovations that shaped human civilization. This understanding changes everything. It challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about human capabilities, cultural development, and the relationship between different peoples and civilizations. It invites us to see the modern world not as the product of a few advanced cultures imposing their will on primitive peoples, but as the result of thousands of years of cultural exchange, technological innovation, and intellectual development involving peoples from every continent. The ancient texts we've examined today offer us a glimpse into this remarkable heritage. They show us that the diversity we see in the modern world isn't a recent development, but has been a fundamental characteristic of human society from the very beginning. They remind us that human achievement has always been a collective enterprise, built through the contributions of peoples from all backgrounds, working together to understand and improve the world around them. The manuscript traditions themselves reveal another layer of this complex story that most people never encounter. When you examine how these ancient texts were preserved, copied, and transmitted across generations, you discover a sophisticated network of scholars and scribes who maintained accurate records across thousands of years. But here's what's particularly fascinating. Many of these manuscript traditions originated in African scriptoriums and centers of learning. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a Greek institution that happened to be located in Egypt. The manuscript evidence reveals that it was built upon much older African traditions of knowledge preservation and scholarly exchange. The methods used to organize, catalogue, and preserve texts at Alexandria were based on systems that had been developed in African centers of learning for centuries before Greek scholars arrived on the scene. When you examine the actual manuscripts that survived from these ancient libraries, the evidence of African influence becomes undeniable. The mathematical treatises, astronomical calculations, and scientific observations preserved in these texts demonstrate levels of sophistication that challenge everything we've been taught about the development of human knowledge. Take the mathematical papyri, for instance. The Rind papyrus and the Moscow papyrus contain mathematical problems and solutions that reveal understanding of advanced geometric principles, algebraic concepts, and even early forms of calculus. These aren't primitive attempts at mathematics. They're sophisticated mathematical systems that wouldn't be matched by other civilizations for centuries. But the mathematical knowledge preserved in these texts goes beyond abstract theory. The practical applications described in these documents reveal how ancient African mathematicians used their knowledge to solve real-world problems. The engineering calculations used in construction projects, the astronomical calculations used for navigation, and the economic calculations used in trade all demonstrate mathematical sophistication that enabled the remarkable achievements we see in the archaeological record. The medical manuscripts present equally compelling evidence of advanced knowledge systems. The surgical procedures described in texts, like the Edwin Smith papyrus, include operations that wouldn't be attempted by European physicians until the modern era. Brain surgery, eye operations, and complex orthopedic procedures are all documented with precision that indicates not just theoretical knowledge, but extensive practical experience. The pharmaceutical knowledge preserved in these medical texts is particularly remarkable. Detailed descriptions of medicinal plants, chemical preparations, and treatment protocols demonstrate understanding of human physiology and biochemistry that was far ahead of its time. Modern pharmacological research has confirmed the effectiveness of many of these ancient remedies, validating the sophisticated medical knowledge of these ancient practitioners. The astronomical manuscripts reveal perhaps the most advanced knowledge systems of all. The star catalogues, eclipse predictions, and planetary calculations preserved in these texts demonstrate understanding of celestial mechanics that required sophisticated mathematical tools and centuries of careful observation. The precision of these astronomical calculations enabled navigation techniques that supported global trade and exploration. But it's not just the technical knowledge that's impressive. The theoretical frameworks underlying these astronomical systems demonstrate sophisticated understanding of cosmic relationships and natural principles. The ancient African astronomers didn't just observe the heavens. They developed comprehensive theories about the structure and behavior of the universe that wouldn't be matched by other civilizations for millennia. The geographic manuscripts provide another fascinating dimension to this investigation. Ancient maps and geographic descriptions reveal knowledge of global geography that challenges conventional ideas about ancient exploration and trade. These texts describe land masses, coastlines, and geographic features with accuracy that suggests direct exploration and mapping, rather than theoretical speculation. The Port-Land charts and other navigational documents reveal the maritime capabilities that made this global knowledge possible. The navigation techniques described in these texts enabled accurate ocean travel across vast distances. The mathematical principles underlying these navigation systems demonstrate understanding of spherical geometry and celestial mechanics that was extremely sophisticated for its time. But the geographic knowledge preserved in these texts extends beyond simple mapping. The descriptions of different regions include detailed information about climate, natural resources, and local populations that could only have been gathered through sustained contact and exploration. These ancient geographers weren't working from second-hand reports. They were documenting direct knowledge of global geography. The linguistic manuscripts reveal another crucial aspect of this ancient knowledge network. The preservation of multiple languages and writing systems in African scriptoriums enabled scholars to access and preserve knowledge from civilizations around the world. These weren't just local libraries serving regional populations. They were international repositories of human knowledge. The translation techniques described in these manuscripts reveal sophisticated understanding of linguistic principles and cultural differences. Ancient African scholars didn't just translate words. They adapted concepts and ideas for different cultural contexts while maintaining accuracy and meaning. This linguistic sophistication enabled the kind of cultural exchange that facilitated global knowledge sharing. The religious manuscripts provide insights into the spiritual and philosophical foundations that supported these remarkable achievements. The theological treatises and philosophical works preserved in these texts reveal sophisticated thinking about fundamental questions of existence, morality, and human purpose. These weren't primitive religious speculations. They were advanced philosophical systems that influenced spiritual development across multiple civilizations. The mystery schools and initiation texts reveal educational systems that preserved and transmitted advanced knowledge through carefully structured programs of study. These educational institutions weren't just training local priests and administrators. They were preparing scholars who would carry African knowledge and wisdom to civilizations around the world. The archaeological evidence confirms what these manuscript traditions describe. Recent excavations at sites across Africa have uncovered libraries, scriptoriums, and educational institutions that demonstrate the physical infrastructure supporting these knowledge preservation systems. These weren't simple storage facilities. They were sophisticated institutional complexes designed for advanced scholarly work. The writing materials and techniques revealed by these archaeological investigations demonstrate technological capabilities that enabled the preservation of vast amounts of information. The paper-making techniques, ink formulations, and binding methods used in these ancient scriptoriums were so advanced that they produced manuscripts that have survived thousands of years in readable condition. But here's where the story takes a particularly intriguing turn. Many of the most important manuscripts from these African centers of learning didn't stay in Africa. They were carried by scholars and traders to libraries and institutions around the world, where they influenced intellectual development in ways that are rarely acknowledged. The manuscript collections in medieval European monasteries contain numerous texts that show clear evidence of African origin. The mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge preserved in these European collections often derives from African sources, though the original attribution has been obscured by centuries of copying and translation. The Islamic libraries of the medieval period contain even more extensive collections of texts that originated in African centers of learning. The great libraries of Baghdad, Cordoba, and other Islamic intellectual centers were built upon foundations of knowledge that had been preserved and developed in African institutions for centuries. The Chinese imperial libraries also contain texts that show evidence of African influence. The Silk Road trade networks that connected Asia with Africa facilitated not just the exchange of goods, but also the transmission of knowledge and ideas. Chinese scholars had access to African mathematical, astronomical, and medical texts that influenced Chinese intellectual development. The preservation techniques used in these various manuscript traditions reveal sophisticated understanding of chemistry, materials science, and environmental control. The methods used to protect manuscripts from deterioration were so effective that texts written thousands of years ago remain readable today. This wasn't accidental preservation. It was the result of deliberate and sophisticated preservation systems. The cataloging and organization systems used in these ancient libraries demonstrate administrative capabilities that rival modern information management systems. The classification schemes, cross-referencing techniques, and search methods used in these institutions enabled scholars to locate and access specific information from vast collections of texts. The copying and distribution networks that connected these various centers of learning reveal communication systems that spanned continents. Manuscripts were regularly copied and distributed between institutions in Africa, Asia, Europe, and even the Americas. This wasn't random or occasional exchange. It was a systematic network designed to ensure that important knowledge was preserved and shared. The quality control systems used in these copying operations were remarkably sophisticated. Scribes used elaborate checking procedures to ensure accuracy, and manuscripts were regularly compared with other copies to identify and correct errors. The precision of these copying operations enabled the accurate transmission of complex technical information across vast distances and long periods of time. The funding and support systems that sustained these knowledge preservation networks reveal the economic foundations that made this intellectual achievement possible. The institutions responsible for preserving and transmitting this knowledge weren't operating on shoestring budgets. They were major economic enterprises supported by wealthy patrons and successful commercial operations. The international character of these knowledge networks challenges conventional ideas about ancient cultural boundaries. Scholars moved freely between institutions in different countries and continents, carrying knowledge and ideas with them. The resulting intellectual cross-pollination created innovations and insights that wouldn't have been possible within isolated cultural systems. The specialization systems developed within these networks enabled unprecedented levels of expertise in specific fields of knowledge. Individual institutions and scholars focused on particular subjects, developing deep expertise that they shared with colleagues around the world. This specialization enabled advances in knowledge that were far beyond what individual scholars or isolated institutions could achieve. The research methodologies developed within these networks established principles of investigation and verification that wouldn't be formalized in other traditions for centuries. Ancient African scholars developed systematic approaches to gathering, testing, and verifying information that enabled them to make discoveries and develop theories that were remarkably accurate. The documentation standards used in these research operations ensured that discoveries and innovations were properly recorded and preserved for future generations. The detailed records of experiments, observations, and theoretical developments enabled cumulative progress in knowledge that built upon previous achievements. The collaborative systems developed within these networks enabled scholars from different institutions and backgrounds to work together on complex problems. The coordination and communication systems that made this collaboration possible were sophisticated enough to support research projects that spanned multiple continents and decades of work. The peer review systems used to evaluate and validate new knowledge ensured that discoveries and theories met high standards of accuracy and reliability. Ancient African scholars didn't just accept new ideas without question. They subjected them to rigorous testing and evaluation before incorporating them into the body of accepted knowledge. The publishing and distribution systems that made this knowledge available to scholars around the world were remarkably efficient. New discoveries and innovations were quickly copied and distributed to relevant institutions, ensuring that important advances were available to scholars who could build upon them. The educational integration systems that incorporated new knowledge into training programs ensured that discoveries and innovations were passed on to new generations of scholars. The curriculum development and teaching methods used in these institutions were sophisticated enough to transmit complex technical knowledge effectively. The practical application systems that connected theoretical knowledge with real-world problem-solving ensured that scholarly discoveries had immediate practical benefits. Ancient African scholars weren't just pursuing knowledge for its own sake. They were developing solutions to practical problems that improved life for people around the world. The quality assurance systems that monitored the accuracy and effectiveness of practical applications ensured that theoretical knowledge translated into reliable, real-world results. The feedback mechanisms that connected practical results with theoretical understanding enabled continuous improvement in both knowledge and application. As we examine this vast network of knowledge preservation and development, the true scope of ancient African intellectual achievement becomes clear. This wasn't just a collection of isolated scholars working on individual projects. It was a sophisticated global system for developing, preserving, and sharing human knowledge that operated for thousands of years. The systematic destruction and suppression of evidence about this network represents one of history's greatest intellectual tragedies. Entire libraries were burned, manuscripts were destroyed, and institutional records were deliberately erased. The knowledge systems that had taken centuries to develop were systematically dismantled, and the evidence of their existence was carefully obscured. But the evidence wasn't completely destroyed. Fragments survived in scattered manuscripts, archaeological remains, and cultural traditions around the world. When you piece together these fragments, the outline of this remarkable intellectual achievement begins to emerge. The picture that appears challenges everything we've been taught about the development of human knowledge and the capabilities of ancient civilizations. The implications of this evidence extend far beyond historical curiosity. The knowledge systems developed by these ancient African institutions represent approaches to learning, research, and problem-solving that could inform modern scientific and educational development. The collaborative methods, quality assurance systems, and practical application techniques they developed offer models that could improve contemporary intellectual work. The preservation techniques they used for maintaining knowledge across long periods could inform modern efforts to preserve digital information and cultural heritage. The organizational systems they developed for managing vast amounts of information could improve modern library and database systems. The research methodologies they developed for investigating complex problems could enhance modern scientific research. The collaborative systems they used for coordinating work across multiple institutions could improve contemporary research partnerships. The educational methods they developed for transmitting complex knowledge could improve modern teaching and training programs. The integration techniques they used for combining theoretical knowledge with practical application could enhance modern professional development. The international networks they developed for sharing knowledge and coordinating research could inform modern efforts to address global challenges through collaborative research and development. The quality assurance systems they used for ensuring accuracy and reliability could improve modern peer review and validation processes. Most importantly, the inclusive and collaborative approach they use for developing knowledge challenges modern assumptions about intellectual competition and cultural boundaries. These ancient scholars understood that the best solutions to complex problems emerge when diverse perspectives and expertise are brought together in collaborative efforts. The evidence we've examined reveals that this understanding wasn't theoretical or idealistic. It was practical and effective. The knowledge systems developed through these collaborative approaches enabled achievements that wouldn't be matched by more isolated and competitive intellectual traditions for centuries. This ancient model of intellectual collaboration offers insights that could transform modern approaches to research, education, and problem solving. When you understand how these ancient knowledge networks operated, you begin to see possibilities for addressing contemporary challenges that go far beyond conventional approaches. The story we've uncovered today represents more than just hidden history. It reveals human potential that has been systematically obscured and forgotten. The capabilities demonstrated by these ancient African intellectual networks show what human beings can achieve when they work together effectively, share knowledge freely, and focus on solving practical problems rather than competing for individual recognition. Understanding this heritage doesn't just change how we view the past, it expands our vision of what's possible in the future. The knowledge systems, collaborative methods, and practical achievements of these ancient networks provide blueprints for addressing the complex challenges facing modern civilization. The evidence is still there, scattered across libraries, museums, and archaeological sites around the world. As more scholars begin to examine this evidence with fresh perspectives, free from the cultural biases that have shaped previous interpretations, the true scope of ancient human achievement continues to emerge. Each new discovery adds another piece to this remarkable puzzle, revealing capabilities and achievements that challenge our basic assumptions about human development and potential. The picture that emerges is one of ancient civilizations that were far more sophisticated, interconnected, and capable than we've been led to believe. But more than that, it's a picture of human beings working together across cultural and geographic boundaries to develop knowledge and solve problems that benefited people around the world. This collaborative approach to intellectual development represents a model that could transform how we approach the challenges and opportunities of the modern era. The ancient texts and archaeological evidence don't just tell us about remarkable achievements of the past. They show us patterns of collaboration, innovation, and problem-solving that could guide us toward a more effective and equitable future. When you understand what human beings have achieved when they work together effectively, you begin to see new possibilities for what we might accomplish in the years ahead.